On the 3rd of September 1939, a 25-year-old English aristocrat sat alone in the English garden in Munich. She had just heard on the radio that Britain had declared war on Germany. She was holding a small pistol. It had been a gift from Adolf Hitler, who considered her one of his closest friends. Her name was Unity Valkyrie Mitford. She pressed the gun to her right temple and pulled the trigger. She did not die. She would linger for another 9 years with a bullet lodged in her brain, tended by her family at their Oxfordshire estate. Speaking in fragments, the damage to her mind absolute and irreversible. These facts sound invented. They are not. Now add the following. Unity had a sister named Diana who had divorced a baronet to become the secret wife of Oswald Mosley, the leader of British fascism, in a private ceremony attended by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels. She would spend 3 years in Holloway prison during the war, interned without trial as a threat to national security. Diana considered this a perfectly manageable inconvenience and remained devoted to Mosley and to her politics for the rest of her long life. Add another, Jessica, who eloped to Spain at 19 to join the international brigades with Esmond Romilly, the nephew of Winston Churchill. She would become a civil rights activist in California, write a devastating exposé of the American funeral industry, and spend her final years monitored by the FBI. Add another, Nancy, who turned the family's chaos into a series of novels that defined a generation's understanding of the English upper class, invented or popularized a vocabulary for social class that is still in use today, and spent the second half of her life in Paris pursuing a French aristocrat who had absolutely no interest in marrying her. Add Pamela, who kept chickens and horses in Gloucestershire and was widely regarded by her sisters as the sanest person in the family, which relative to the rest of them is an assertion so modest it becomes its own kind of comedy. Add Deborah, who became the Duchess of Devonshire, saved Chatsworth House from financial ruin, turned it into one of the most visited stately homes in England, and wrote best-selling books about farming. She was the last survivor. She died in 2014 at the age of 94, outliving almost everything: the war, the fascism, the communism, the bullet in her sister's brain, and the particular 20th century that had produced all of them. And then add Tom, the brother and only son who read law at Oxford, played piano, studied German literature and culture, moved in the most dangerous political circles of the 1930s, and died fighting in Burma in 1945, 6 weeks before the war in Europe ended. 6 sisters and a brother. 1 household. 1 set of parents. 1 nursery. Out of that nursery came more history than most countries manage in a generation. The story of the Mitford family is, at its core, the story of what happens when you give 6 of the most naturally intelligent people of the 20th century absolutely no formal education, absolutely no obvious direction, and absolutely no preparation for the world that was about to arrive. The world arrived anyway. They walked straight into it, and the collision reshaped everything. If this kind of story pulls you in, the kind that feels almost unbelievable until you realize it isn't, then you'll want to stay close to this channel. We are trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this month, and the people who subscribe early are the ones who end up shaping what this becomes. And one more thing, don't just watch this silently. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or your country in the comments. I read them, and it's the only way I get to see who's really on the other side of the screen. Chapter 1. The Flawed Origin. The Man Who Made Them Possible. David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, the 2nd Baron Redesdale, was by most available evidence a man held together almost entirely by contradictions. He had served with distinction in the Boer War and in the First World War, sustaining a serious lung wound in the latter that removed a portion of 1 lung and left him permanently short of breath and permanently short of patience for anything he considered intellectually soft, which included most things. He had opinions about every conceivable subject and expertise in almost none. He read almost nothing. He regarded books as a category with the specific contempt of a man who has decided that reading is a habit of people who lack the courage to live. He once described a bookshelf as a conspiracy of dead men against the living. He loved his children with an unself-conscious ferocity that alternated, without warning or transition, with an equally unself-conscious fury that could clear a breakfast table in seconds. He called his daughters the girls and treated them as a collective rather than as individuals, which is one of several ways in which he inadvertently ensured that each of them would spend the rest of her life fighting for exactly the kind of individual recognition he had never given her. He was a man whose single greatest failure and single greatest achievement were the same thing. He created the conditions that produced the Mitford sisters, and he did so entirely by accident. He had another quality his daughters inherited and transformed: an absolute conviction that the way he saw things was the way things were. Not arrogance exactly, but the deep structural certainty of a man who had never been required to revise his fundamental assumptions. He believed in England and fox hunting and the absolute horror of what he called abroad. It was not a worldview equipped to deal with the 20th century, and his children were the 20th century's primary instrument for demonstrating this. He was, for much of his adult life, in financial difficulty. He had inherited an estate and the title and the expectations that came with both, and had no particular aptitude for the business of maintaining them. He farmed without systematic success. He invested without systematic success. He failed at a gold mine in Canada. He failed at a timber business. He failed at several other ventures whose precise nature has been mercifully obscured by his descendants' memoirs. He kept moving the family, from Asthall Manor to Swinbrook House, from London to the Cotswolds and back. And each move was slightly smaller, slightly more constrained by the arithmetic of a fortune that was not replenishing itself fast enough. And yet out of this house, out of this man's inconsistent, opinionated, financially imperiled household, came 6 daughters and a son who would, between them, befriend Adolf Hitler, marry the leader of British fascism, elope to a communist war zone, reshape the English novel, save a ducal inheritance, and become one of the more improbable families of the 20th century. This is not despite David Freeman Mitford. It is, in a way that requires careful examination, because of him. His wife, Sydney Bowles, was a different proposition entirely. She was organized where David was chaotic, quiet where he was loud, and possessed of a domestic stubbornness that kept the household functioning through every financial reversal and social upheaval. She was also, by temperament and conviction, someone who did not believe in formal education for girls. She educated her daughters herself, at home, with the assistance of a series of governesses of varying competence, a system that ensured the girls learned to read and write and do basic arithmetic, and not much more in the formal sense, while simultaneously giving them enormous amounts of unstructured time in each other's company to read what they liked, think what they liked, argue about everything, and develop the fiercely individual intellectual identities that would later manifest as, among other things, a personal friendship with the Führer of Germany and a foundational text of American consumer advocacy. The irony is almost too neat. The woman who chose not to formally educate her daughters accidentally produced some of the most intellectually formidable women of their generation. Sydney Mitford would not have seen it as irony. She would have seen it as confirmation. David Freeman Mitford succeeded and failed at fatherhood simultaneously, which is the only way to describe a man whose parenting style produced both a passionate fascist and a passionate communist from the same nursery within 4 years of each other. He was, his daughters reported later, impossible to ignore, easy to provoke, genuinely loving in his way, and constitutionally incapable of engaging with any of them as independent minds rather than as extensions of his own domestic world. He spent the next 4 decades failing at nearly everything except, inadvertently, at creating the pressurized environment that would send his children shooting outward into the most extreme positions of the most extreme century in living memory. He lived to see enough of it. When Unity shot herself in Munich in 1939, David was 61 years old. He had already watched Diana go to prison. He had already watched Jessica elope to a war zone. He had read Nancy's novels about a family that bore more than a passing resemblance to his own, and had reportedly not been amused. He and Sydney separated during the war. He died in 1958, at 80, having outlived Unity and seen the remnants of everything he had thought he was building come apart and reassemble into something he would never entirely have recognized. He had given them everything except direction. That, in the end, was the gift. The direction they found for themselves was, by any objective measurement, more interesting than anything he could have provided. Chapter 2. The Nursery as Pressure Vessel, What No School Produces. Picture the nursery at Asthall Manor in the early 1920s. It is a room in a moderately large Oxfordshire house that David Freeman Mitford bought in 1919. Bought, characteristically, in a moment of unplanned enthusiasm for a property he could not quite afford, attached to a barn that held a remarkable library from the previous owner and that he used almost exclusively to avoid his wife. The house had grounds. It had the slow, green Oxfordshire countryside outside its windows. And inside, it had 6 girls and eventually a boy with nothing to do, from morning to night, except talk to each other. The house itself was a character in the story. Asthall Manor had the specific quality of large English country houses of that period. Slightly too big, heated with the efficiency of good intentions and bad radiators, possessed of rooms whose original purposes had been forgotten. The barn with the library was the most important room in the complex, not because David valued it, but because he didn't, which meant the girls could use it freely, at all hours, without supervision, without anyone checking what they were reading or whether they were old enough for it. An 8-year-old Nancy could read anything in that barn without a single adult asking whether it was appropriate. It almost never was. This was the entire point. Here was no television. There was no radio for much of this period. There was no school run, no homework, no extracurricular schedule, no organized social calendar of the kind that fills the days of children today with the benign clutter of piano lessons and sports matches. There was Sydney's intermittent instruction in the basics. There were the governesses, and there was the library in the barn, which the girls could access freely, and which contained everything from Shakespeare to the complete Encyclopedia Britannica to whatever novels had been left behind by the previous occupants, and which David Freeman Mitford never entered because he had no use for books and was therefore never available to prevent his daughters from reading anything they liked, at any age they liked, without any supervision or guidance whatsoever. This is how you accidentally produce a novelist who would reshape English social comedy. You give her unlimited access to a library at the age of 8 and never supervise her reading. Nancy Mitford read everything in that barn library by the time she was 12, and she read it with the fierce, contextless, self-directed hunger of a child who has no teacher telling her what anything means and must therefore decide for herself. It did not produce a conventional education. It produced something considerably rarer, a literary sensibility that was entirely self-assembled, eccentric, sharp as broken glass, and prepared to treat the world's pretensions with the specific comic contempt of someone who has read widely enough to know that pretension has always been ridiculous. But the library was only part of it. The real education happened in the room itself, among the 6 of them, in the relentless daily conversation that sisters who live in each other's company generate as naturally as weather. They invented games. They developed an elaborate private vocabulary, the Mitford language that their intimates would spend decades attempting to decode, a lexicon of affectionate contempt and in-group reference that was both a sign of their closeness and a weapon against the outside world. They argued. They formed alliances and broke them. They teased without mercy and loved without restraint and observed each other with the unsentimental clarity that only people who have grown up in the same small space can achieve. Jessica, who was 4 years younger than Unity and 6 years younger than Diana, described the nursery years in her memoir as a contained world of almost complete self-sufficiency. She and Unity were particularly close during this period, sharing a bed, sharing a passion for a game they called the Hans, which involved admitting only certain sisters to an inner circle whose membership requirements shifted according to unrecorded criteria. The intimacy of this period makes what came later. Unity in Munich, Jessica in Spain, Diana in Holloway, the family fractured along lines that would never fully repair. Even more devastating to contemplate. They started from the same room. They ended in different worlds. The pressure was not immediately visible. From outside, the household looked like what it was: a moderately cash-strapped English aristocratic family managing the aftermath of the First World War with a combination of habit, stubbornness, and the particular English upper-class talent for making financial difficulty look like a lifestyle choice. David farmed without great success. Sydney managed the household with great efficiency. The children were healthy, vivid, and by all accounts extraordinarily present. The kind of children who make a room feel populated even when it isn't. But the real pressure was not the house. It was the combination of 6 extremely intelligent girls with no formal education, no obvious outlet for their energy, and parents who had given them everything except direction. That pressure was building every year. By the late 1920s, the oldest ones were reaching adulthood with an arsenal of native intelligence, a library's worth of self-assembled ideas, and no particularly obvious context in which to deploy them. The world they were supposed to walk into, the world of the English country house, the London season, the presentation at court, the appropriate marriage, was a world calibrated for a different kind of woman. They were not a different kind of woman. They were exactly this kind. and the collision between who they were and what the world expected of them was about to begin in earnest. Nancy would make it literature. Diana would make it politics. Unity would make it an obsession that history cannot fully explain. Jessica would make it a lifelong act of class apostasy. And Deborah would eventually build something that lasted longer than any of the politics or the novels or the scandals. A house, open to the public, still standing. Chapter 3. Nancy, the one who wrote it down. Nancy Freeman Mitford was born in 1904, the eldest, which in this family meant that she served simultaneously as the original and as the template against which every subsequent sister was measured and found different. She was tall, funny, wickedly observant, and constitutionally incapable of treating anything with the reverence it believed it deserved. She had inherited her father's capacity for strong opinion and her mother's domestic practicality, and had alchemized both into something entirely her own. A social intelligence so acute and a comic sensibility so precise that she would eventually produce novels that a generation of English readers recognized as the truest account of their own world they had ever encountered. She was also, for much of her life, catastrophically unlucky in love, which is the kind of biographical detail that sounds trivial until you understand that it was the engine of everything she wrote. She fell for Peter Rod, known in the family as Prod, a nickname that managed to be both affectionate and devastating, in the early 1930s. Rod was handsome, well-connected, occasionally brilliant, and professionally unreliable in the specific way of men who have been told they are exceptional since childhood and have consequently never been required to demonstrate it. Nancy married him in 1933. It was not a good marriage. It was, however, a very productive one in the literary sense, because Prod's intermittent presence, perpetual financial difficulty, and constitutional fidelity to no one in particular gave Nancy the experience she needed to write about the English upper classes with the specific authority of someone who has loved one of them and survived it. Her first novels were apprentice work: Highland Fling, Christmas Pudding, Wigs on the Green, competent, funny, showing the shape of the gift without fully deploying it. Wigs on the Green caused a rupture with Diana and Unity, who recognized it as a satire on the British Union of Fascists and did not find it amusing in 1935. Nancy found it very funny indeed. This was a difference that would take years to heal. Then 1945. The war had ended. Prod had distinguished himself in several different ways, almost none of them the ones Nancy would have preferred, and the marriage was functionally over even if the paperwork took longer. Nancy published The Pursuit of Love, which took the family, thinly disguised, grotesquely recognizable, and turned it into one of the funniest and most emotionally precise English novels of the century. The character of Uncle Matthew, the gun-toting, book-hating, foxhound-obsessed patriarch of the Radlett family, is David Freeman Mitford in every detail, so exact and so affectionate and so merciless that the book's readers who knew the family could not believe it had been permitted, and the readers who didn't know the family simply recognized it as true. The Pursuit of Love sold in enormous quantities and made Nancy famous in a way that her previous books had not, and it was followed in 1949 by Love in a Cold Climate, which was, if anything, even funnier and even more precisely observed. Together they constitute one of the great comic double acts in English literature. Two novels that look, from outside, like drawing-room comedies, and that are, from inside, exact studies in the psychic cost of growing up in a world where love is assumed but never quite adequately expressed. During this period, Nancy had moved to Paris and was in the process of conducting a long, essentially unrequited passion for Gaston Paluski, a senior figure in the French government and a man of considerable charm and limited romantic reliability. He appears in the novels as the Frenchman, glamorous, elusive, almost deliberately unavailable, and Nancy's friends found it painful to watch, and Nancy continued regardless with the same cheerful stoicism she brought to everything, and eventually the entire affair became another book. She was also, during this period, doing something that the literary establishment of the time was still figuring out how to classify. She was writing comic novels about the English upper class from inside the English upper class, with the specific authority of a woman who had grown up in it and also grown out of it, and who retained enough affection for it to find it funny rather than merely ridiculous. The Mitford voice in Nancy's fiction is not the voice of a satirist who despises her subject. It is the voice of someone who loves her subject in spite of knowing it completely, who can describe the particular way a certain kind of English person sits in a chair and makes you understand, in the describing, both what is absurd about it and why it has persisted for 400 years. This is a harder trick than it looks. He remained in Paris for the rest of her life, writing, entertaining, corresponding with her sisters in the voluminous, razor-sharp letters that would eventually be published and become essential reading for anyone who wanted to understand the Mitford voice. That particular combination of intellectual seriousness and comic deflection, of genuine feeling and the refusal to ever be caught displaying it without irony. She died of Hodgkin's disease in 1973. In the Paris flat she had made her own over 2 decades, having spent her final years in considerable pain with the grace and the vicious wit intact until almost the end. She wrote it all down. That was her particular power and her particular survival mechanism. Everything that happened to the family, everything that was done and suffered and survived, was, for Nancy, potential material. It was not callousness. It was the novelist's specific metabolism, the ability to look at pain and think, in the back of the mind where the writing happens, this is the shape of something true. She was the Mitford who made them permanent. Without her, they are history. With her, they are literature. Chapter 4, Pamela and Tom, the ones history almost forgot. In the taxonomy of the Mitford sisters, Pamela occupies a position that is nearly impossible to describe without comic recourse. She was the second eldest, born in 1907, 1 year after Nancy, and she was in a family that produced a fascist, a communist, and a novelist who reshaped English comedy. A woman who loved horses, chickens, dogs, country cooking, and the specific pleasures of a well-managed smallholding. She was called Woman by her siblings, a nickname whose origins have never been entirely explained, but whose persistence across decades says something about the family's particular brand of affection, which was always expressed through the specific vocabulary of the harmless absurd. She had been partially paralyzed as a child by polio, an experience that left no permanent physical mark, but that set her slightly apart from the fierce physical energy of her siblings in ways that may have inclined her toward the contained world of the farm rather than the wide world of events. She married the physicist Derek Jackson in 1936, a man of genuine scientific distinction who held a chair at Oxford and had, as a secondary career, ridden in the Grand National and served with exceptional bravery as a radio operator in the RAF during the Second World War. The marriage did not last, but it produced the impression of a woman who was both more intellectually connected and more eccentrically independent than her reputation, as the quiet Mitford suggested. Pamela's function in the mythology of the Mitford family is to be the punchline at the end of the list. After the fascist and the communist and the novelist and the duchess, there is always a beat and then. And one sister who kept chickens in Gloucestershire. It is a perfectly structured comic beat, and it serves its purpose, which is to demonstrate the range of outcomes from a single household. But it does Pamela a quiet injustice. She was the stable one. She was the one who was always there, who could always be called, who maintained the physical world of animals and seasons and food, and whether that grounded the family in something outside the tumult they had collectively generated. In a family that had repeatedly flown apart into the most extreme positions available, Pamela was the center of gravity. Her brother Tom stands in a different relation to the family legend. Not ignored, exactly, but perpetually on the edge of the frame, a figure whose significance keeps seeming greater the more carefully you look, and whose early death ensures he will always be, at least partly, a question rather than an answer. Thomas David Freeman Mitford was born in 1909, the only boy, loved by his sisters with a devotion that the memoirs and letters make unmistakably clear. He was by all accounts brilliant, musically gifted in a way none of the sisters were, legally trained at the Inner Temple, deeply read in German literature and culture, fluent in German and French, entirely at ease in European intellectual circles that his contemporaries could not access. He had also, in the 1930s, moved in circles that included fascist sympathizers, and there are letters and accounts that suggest he was not untouched by the politics that consumed Diana and unity. Though the precise nature of his convictions has been debated by historians because he left no manifesto, and because his death in April 1945 in Burma means he never had the opportunity to account for himself in the way the surviving sisters eventually did. He had specifically requested a posting to the Far East, reportedly to avoid fighting Germans, which is either a fine moral distinction or a complicated evasion, depending on where you stand. And there is no surviving Tom Mitford to help us decide. He was, by the accounts that survive, extraordinary company, the kind of person around whom conversations became more interesting, who could sit at a piano and play for an hour while his sisters talked around him, who wore his multiple languages lightly and his politics heavily, who moved between the aristocratic and intellectual worlds of 1930s England with a facility that the letters about him consistently describe as effortless. He was also the object of a devotion in his sisters that is hard to overstate. In a family of 6 girls, the brother was a kind of collective treasure, adored, protected, central to the emotional architecture of the nursery in ways that none of them would fully register until he was gone. He died on April 18, 1945, of wounds sustained in action in Burma, 6 weeks before the war in Europe ended. He was 35 years old. His sisters who survived him, Nancy, Pamela, Jessica, Deborah, would carry the loss for the rest of their lives, and the letters in which they discuss it are among the few moments in the Mitford correspondence where the usual armor of comedy and deflection falls entirely away and you are reading something nakedly, unmanageably sad. Pamela outlived all of her sisters. She died in 1994 at 86, having maintained her horses and dogs and her Gloucestershire life through the full arc of the century, which had generated fascism and communism and a world war and a Cold War and the entire convulsing transformation of English society, and had left Pamela in Gloucestershire, feeding chickens, keeping the thing together. Her sisters were the extraordinary ones. She was the one who stayed. The family needed both kinds. It needed the ones who flew outward into history and the one who stayed in place and held the center. Without the center, the ones who flew outward would have had nothing to return to. Without the ones who flew outward, there would have been no story. Pamela and Tom, between them, remind us that the most extreme family in England was also, underneath everything, a family, with the specific gravity and specific loss that any family accumulates, and that no amount of history or scandal or legend fully displaces. Chapter 5, Diana, the Believer. Diana Mitford was born in 1910 and was, by universal agreement, including the accounts of people who despised her politics, one of the most beautiful women of her generation. This is not a trivial fact in her story. It is a structural one. Her beauty gave her access to people, to rooms, to conversations, to the specific social mechanism of the English upper class in which exceptional appearance functions as a kind of passport to otherwise closed worlds. And the worlds she used that passport to access were, in the 1930s, the most dangerous rooms in Europe. She married Brian Guinness, heir to the brewing fortune at 18, and the marriage by all accounts began happily enough. London parties, literary friends, the children who followed. But Diana had, from her earliest years, the quality that marked all the Mitford sisters at their most extreme: a complete inability to do anything by half measures. When she fell in love with Oswald Mosley in 1932, she did not fall carefully or privately, or with any of the normal social self-preservation mechanisms that might have suggested limits. She left Brian Guinness. She gave up the fortune. She gave up the social position. She gave up the literary circle and the parties and the safe, comfortable trajectory of a well-married English aristocrat and walked, with absolute deliberateness, toward the most controversial political figure in Britain. Oswald Mosley was at that point still, to some observers, a serious political operator, a former cabinet minister, a man of genuine if wildly misdirected intelligence, someone whose economic ideas in the late 1920s had actually been more sophisticated than those of the Labour government he served. By the early 1930s, he had moved decisively toward fascism, had founded the British Union of Fascists in 1932, had begun the organization of the black shirts and the public spectacles and the rallies that were modeled, with insufficient distance, on what was happening in Germany. Diana became his partner, his organizer, and eventually, in 1936, his wife. The wedding was in Germany. It took place in the Berlin drawing room of Joseph Goebbels. Adolf Hitler attended as a guest. Diana had met Hitler through unity and had developed what she described, in terms that remained consistent across 7 decades of interviews, as a genuine admiration for him, for his political vision, for what she believed he had achieved in Germany, for the Germany she experienced during her visits in the 1930s, which she found energetic and purposeful and vastly preferable to the stagnation she diagnosed in England. She never repudiated this. She was still being interviewed in her 90s, still calm, still articulate, still explaining in the measured tones of a woman who has been explaining something for 60 years, that the Holocaust had been a terrible thing for which no one had provided her a satisfactory causal account, and that this failure of causal explanation left her, she was afraid, unable to fully revise her position. This combination, the beauty, the intelligence, the absolute moral blindness on the central question, makes Diana the most complicated of the Mitford sisters to write about and probably the most important. She is the one who makes the question unavoidable. How does this happen? How does an intelligent person arrive at and maintain, for an entire lifetime, a political position of this nature? The answer is not simple and not comfortable, and it does not reduce to stupidity or wickedness, which would be easier. It involves the specific pathology of ideological commitment in people of high intelligence, the way certainty can substitute for morality in a mind that has never been given an external framework against which to test either. When the war began, Diana and Moseley were both interned under Defense Regulation 18B, which permitted the detention without trial of persons believed to be a threat to national security. They were held in Holloway Prison for 3 years, initially separated, eventually permitted to share a small garden cottage within the prison grounds. Diana was 31 when she went in. She had 2 small children from her marriage to Moseley. She was, by the regulations of the institution, a prisoner. She consistently described this period in interviews as uncomfortable rather than traumatic, and this response, the complete absence of self-pity, the refusal to present herself as a victim, is one of the few things about Diana that commands a kind of unwilling respect even in people who find her politics indefensible. She was released in 1943 on health grounds, over the objections of a significant portion of the cabinet and much of the British public, who were at that point in the middle of fighting a war against exactly the ideology Diana had spent the preceding decade advancing. The reaction to her release was so hostile that she and Moseley went to live in Ireland after the war, and then eventually to a house outside Paris, where Diana would remain, writing, entertaining, corresponding, conducting long and lucid interviews in which she explained herself with complete composure and absolutely no concession to the expectation of remorse, for the rest of her very long life. She died in 2003 at 93, the most unreconstructed of all the Mitfords, her position unchanged from the 1930s to the end. She was the believer. Among a family full of people who felt things deeply and committed completely, she was the one who committed to a thing that history has judged irredeemably and never, not once, changed her mind. The question Diana forces us to confront is not comfortable. How does a person of evident intelligence maintain, across 7 decades, a position that history has rendered catastrophically wrong? The answer is that intelligence is not a guarantee against ideology. It is, in certain circumstances, an accelerant. Diana had the intelligence to construct an internally consistent worldview and the stubbornness to maintain it. None of these qualities required her to be right. They only required her to be certain. Certainty is available to the wrong as readily as to the right. The Mitford nursery produced brilliant people. It did not produce, in Diana's case, a person equipped to recognize when brilliance was in the service of something terrible. Chapter 6, Unity the Sacrifice. Unity Valkyrie Mitford is the one the story cannot look away from. She is the figure at the center of the family's most extreme history, the one whose trajectory from Oxfordshire nursery to Adolf Hitler's personal circle to a park bench in Munich with a pistol is so unlikely that even people who know it well find themselves stopping, rereading it, checking that they have the details right. They are always right. The details are always exactly what they were. She was born in 1914, the 4th daughter, and her middle name is not accidental mythology. Her parents were in the small town of Swastika, Ontario, at the time of her birth, a town that had been named after the local mining company's logo decades before the symbol acquired its subsequent meaning. Nancy, whose relationship with dark material was to turn it into comedy, found this endlessly amusing for the rest of her life. Unity was named Valkyrie. Whether Sydney and David had any sense of what they were prefiguring is unknowable. She grew up as the most physically imposing of the sisters, tall, heavy-boned, possessed of the kind of presence that rooms simply have to accommodate, and as the one most obviously in Diana's orbit, following her older sister's enthusiasms with an intensity that was characteristic of her. She was not intellectual in Nancy's mode or political in Jessica's mode. She was passionate in the specific way of people who have very deep feeling and not quite enough irony to keep it from overwhelming everything else. She attached herself to things absolutely. When she attached herself to National Socialism in the early 1930s, following Diana's lead into Moseley's circle, and then further, into Germany itself, she attached herself absolutely. She moved to Munich in 1934, at the age of 19, specifically and deliberately to meet Adolf Hitler. She sat every day for months in the Osteria Bavaria, a restaurant that Hitler was known to frequent, waiting for him to notice her. This is the action of a person with no normal self-protective instinct, no ordinary capacity for embarrassment, and no comprehension of proportionality. It worked. Hitler noticed her. He invited her to his table. He found her English aristocratic enthusiasm for National Socialism amusing and flattering and genuinely useful from a propaganda standpoint. A beautiful young woman from the English upper class publicly, enthusiastically devoted to him was not nothing. In the mid-1930s, when he was still concerned with how England would respond to Germany's expansion. Their friendship, and by all documentary evidence it was a friendship, not a romance, whatever Unity may have wanted it to be, lasted for 5 years. She attended the Nuremberg rallies. She sat in his private box at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. She was photographed with him, with Goering, with Goebbels, at events that were the most public exhibitions of a regime in the process of building the architecture of state violence. She wrote letters home that her family received with varying degrees of alarm, enthusiasm, and horror, depending on the recipient. Nancy thought it was all appalling and said so with her usual precision. Jessica had by this point eloped to Spain and was developing her own politics that were the exact mirror image of Unity's. David, astonishingly, visited Germany and met Hitler with Unity acting as interpreter, and came away with the impression that the man was doing rather well for Germany, an assessment that he would later slowly revise. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, Unity was in Munich. The declaration meant that the country she had spent 5 years celebrating had just become the enemy of the country she had been born in. She had publicly and repeatedly said that she would kill herself if Britain and Germany went to war. She was not speaking metaphorically. She went to the English garden. She sat on a bench. She took out the small pistol that Hitler had given her as a gift, and she used it. The bullet lodged in her brain without killing her. She survived, initially in a German hospital, then transported to Switzerland and from there back to England, where her parents collected her. She was 25 years old, and the person who arrived back in England was not the person who had left. She spoke in fragments. She had reverted, in some ways, to a much younger version of herself, childlike, confused, frightened by things that had not frightened the previous Unity, continent in ways that were humiliating for a grown woman, and that required her family to manage. The vivid, consuming intelligence and the consuming passion had been replaced by damage. Hitler's response to her injury was, by the records, genuine grief. He paid her medical bills. He arranged her transport. Whether this was propaganda or actual feeling is impossible to determine at 70 years of distance, and probably was not entirely one thing or the other. He was a man of whom the straightforward biographical categories are always inadequate. Unity lived with the bullet in her brain for 9 years, cared for largely by her mother, dying at 33 in 1948 of meningitis caused by the original wound finally progressing. The family buried her in Swinbrook churchyard, and Nancy wrote to a friend afterward with the specific Mitford combination of grief and gallows comedy that the family deployed in place of conventional mourning. She was glad it was over, and she hoped Unity had found whatever it was she had been so desperately looking for. She never did find it. The century had what she wanted, and it destroyed her trying to give it to her. What Unity's story leaves us with is the specific tragedy of absolute commitment to the wrong thing. She was not calculating. She was not advancing herself. She attached herself to National Socialism because she believed in it entirely, with the full force of the personality the nursery had produced. The nursery had given her the capacity for absolute commitment. The century had given her the wrong thing to commit to. Chapter 7, Jessica, the Mirror. If Unity is the figure history finds most difficult to look at directly, Jessica is the one who makes that difficulty legible. She is the explanation. Not for Unity exactly, but for the mechanism, for the way the same nursery, the same parents, the same early years of self-directed intellectual formation produce two human beings who end up on opposite sides of the most catastrophic political division in modern history. Jessica and Unity shared a bed for years during childhood. They invented the Hans together. They were, by their own accounts and by accounts from those who knew them, as close as two of the Mitford sisters ever were. And by the end of the 1930s, one of them was Hitler's friend, and one of them had joined the international brigades to fight the fascists in Spain. Jessica Freeman Mitford was born in 1917, the fifth daughter, and from a very early age demonstrated the family characteristic of commitment, without half measures, in a political direction that was exactly opposite to Diana's and Unity's. She described herself in her memoirs as having been, from childhood, instinctively opposed to the values she saw around her. The class structure, the unexamined privilege, the taken-for-granted hierarchy of the English upper class that treated everyone outside it as set dressing. This opposition was not, at first, formally political. It was emotional and intuitive, the response of an intelligent child who had been given enough time alone with books and her own thoughts to recognize that the world she had been born into was arranged in ways that could be questioned. She began questioning them very early. She was reading left-wing political material in her early teens. She saved up pocket money for what she called her running away fund, with the stated intention of escaping the world into which she had been born. She attended the communist bookshop in London as a teenager and read everything she could find. She met Esmond Romilly, the nephew of Winston Churchill, already a veteran of the Spanish Civil War at 17, already something of a left-wing celebrity for having edited a pacifist magazine at Wellington College and sparked a national debate. In 1936, when she was 19, and within weeks had made the decision that she was going to Spain with him. She did not ask her parents. She told them by cable from Dieppe. The elopement to Spain is the Jessica Mitford moment that most defines her in the popular imagination. But what is less often noted is how completely consistent it was with everything the nursery had produced. The Mitford method, whether it manifested as Unity's pilgrimage to Munich or Diana's abandonment of the Guinness fortune or Nancy's move to Paris, was always the same. Identify the thing you believe in completely, and then walk toward it without hesitation and without looking back. Jessica walked toward the Spanish Civil War at 19. She and Esmond married in Spain. They returned to England under something approaching diplomatic pressure, faced her family, and then, in 1939, emigrated to the United States, where Esmond was killed while serving with the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941. He was 23. Jessica stayed in America. She was 24, widowed, alone in a country that was not hers, with a daughter to raise. She had nothing except what she had always had: her intelligence, her political convictions, and the Mitford family's particular incapacity for being broken by things that should, by rights, have broken her. She remarried to Robert Truhaft, a labor lawyer in California, and together they spent the next decades doing work that was simultaneously deeply serious and deeply funny, the combination that defined Jessica as a writer as surely as it defined Nancy. She worked as a civil rights organizer in the American South during a period when this was neither safe nor fashionable. She joined the American Communist Party. She was investigated by the FBI, which maintained a file on her for decades that, when she eventually obtained it under the Freedom of Information Act, she found so incompetent and so comically overblown that she wrote about it with the kind of glee that only a woman who has survived everything can generate at the expense of a surveillance apparatus. She wrote The American Way of Death in 1963, an investigation into the American funeral industry's manipulation of grief and its systematic exploitation of bereaved families. It became a bestseller, provoked legislative action, and remains in print. It is, alongside Nancy's novels, the most lasting literary achievement produced by the Mitford Nursery, a combination of outrage and deadpan comedy that is exactly the family voice applied to an entirely different subject matter. She and Diana, in the decades after the war, essentially did not speak. The politics had been too extreme, the war too real, the crimes of fascism too documented, for Jessica to find in herself the particular Mitford talent for maintaining family warmth across political divisions. Diana remained friendly with Nancy. Diana and Pamela remained close. But Jessica and Diana existed in the same family and in permanently different moral worlds, and the letters and memoirs that circle this fact never quite resolve it, because it cannot be resolved. The Mitford voice in Jessica is the same voice as in Nancy, the same fundamental instrument, played in a different register. Where Nancy used it as a vehicle for social comedy, Jessica used it as a vehicle for political outrage, and the effect was similar. The comedy made the outrage bearable, and the outrage gave the comedy weight. The American Way of Death is a genuinely funny book about a genuinely appalling subject, which is exactly the Mitford formula applied to the funeral industry of 1960s America. It should not work as well as it does. It works completely. She died in 1996 in California, still registered as a Communist Party member, still working, still funny, still indignant. The FBI file they kept on her ran to several hundred pages. She considered this a reasonable indicator that she had spent her time well. Chapter 8. The War as Crucible, what September 1939 did to the family. On September 3, 1939, the Mitford family was in more places simultaneously than any other single family in Britain. Unity was in Munich, in the English garden, doing what we already know. Diana was in England, where she and Moseley were shortly to be arrested and interned. Jessica was in America with Esmond Romilly, having departed England months earlier with the clear-eyed judgment of someone who could see where things were heading. Nancy was in London, making the most of her observation of everything going on around her with the novelist's furious attention. Pamela was in the country. Deborah was 17 and in the middle of the social season. Tom was about to enlist. The declaration of war on September 3rd is the hinge point of the family's story. Before that day, the various Mitford commitments, Diana's fascism, Unity's obsession, Jessica's communism, Nancy's novels that made comedy out of all of it, were extreme but containable within the frame of personal politics, the kind of positions that a democracy could accommodate at the price of considerable public controversy. After that day, the positions became something different. They became, in the fullest sense, a matter of which side you were on. Nancy's experience of the war is in some ways the most practically interesting of the surviving sisters, because it was also the most ordinary, which is to say that Nancy Mitford spent the war in London doing actual war work, serving in various capacities, including work for a free French organization that brought her into contact with Gaston Paluski, the man who would become the great, painful, productive emotional fact of her post-war life. She endured the bombing of London with the same grim competence she brought to everything and found, in the experience of a city under genuine threat, material that would eventually feed the emotional undertow of her best novels. The sense of lives being lived at full intensity against a backdrop of loss. The war clarified Nancy's position on Diana in a way that no amount of previous political disagreement had. It is one thing to find your sister's fascism dismaying in peacetime when the worst it produces is embarrassing newspaper coverage. It is another to be in bombed London knowing that your sister is in prison partly because she posed a material threat to the country's survival. Nancy wrote a letter during this period, in her private correspondence, recommending that Diana not be released early from Holloway. She was not, she explained in various subsequent accounts, doing this out of malice. She was doing it because she believed Diana genuinely was a security risk, and that the normal rules of family loyalty had been superseded by the normal rules of existing in a country fighting for its survival. The particular cruelty of Nancy's position is that it was also, in its own terms, correct. Nancy was not wrong that Diana was a security risk. The British government's own assessment confirmed this. The painful thing is not that Nancy was wrong. It is that she was right, and that being right about your sister in wartime means something different than being right about a stranger. A difference that does not resolve cleanly regardless of how many decades you give it. Yana knew about this letter decades later and considered it a profound betrayal. Nancy considered it a reasonable judgment call. This disagreement persisted for decades and was never fully resolved, and it is one of the places where the Mitford story stops being comic and is simply completely human. Two sisters who loved each other, navigating a situation in which love and judgment and loyalty and survival had all come into conflict, and in which there was genuinely no resolution available that did not cost someone something permanent. Tom Mitford's experience of the war was brief and fatal. He served in the Middle East and later requested a transfer to the Burma campaign specifically to avoid fighting Germans, a decision that his surviving sisters interpreted variously. He died in April 1945, and the letters that followed, Nancy's, Pamela's, Deborah's, eventually Jessica's when the news reached California, are among the most affecting documents in the Mitford archive. The death of the brother, the only brother, the one the sisters had loved with a particular devotion, stripped away, briefly and completely, the protective irony that the family had always used as its primary emotional vocabulary. Deborah, who had married Andrew Cavendish, heir to the Duke of Devonshire, in 1941, found her own war shaped by a different kind of loss. Andrew's older brother Billy, the heir apparent who had been expected to become the Duke, was killed in action in September 1944, which made Andrew the heir and transformed Deborah's expected future from that of a pleasant aristocratic life into that of a woman who would eventually be responsible for the management of one of the great English ducal houses. She was 24 when Billy died. She had been a duchess in waiting without entirely knowing it. Now the waiting was over. What September 1939 did to the family was reveal the full consequence of the directions in which the nursery pressure had driven each of them. The extremity of the positions: Hitler's friend in a Munich park, Diana in Holloway, Jessica in California, Nancy in bombed London, Tom in Burma, was not produced by the war. The war only made visible what had been there all along, in the house, in the library, in the conversations between 6 sisters who had been given too much intelligence and too little direction, and had therefore gone, each in her own way and at full speed, precisely where her convictions led her. Chapter 9. Deborah, the last one standing. Deborah Vivian Freeman Mitford was born in 1920, the youngest of the 6 daughters, and she lived until 2014. She was 93 years old, and she had seen everything. She had seen Unity go to Munich and come back with a bullet in her brain. She had seen Diana go to prison and come out unchanged. She had seen Jessica elope to Spain and stay in America and become a communist activist and write a book that changed the funeral industry and be monitored by the FBI for decades. She had seen Nancy write the family into literature and then live in Paris and die of a disease that lasted years. She had seen Pamela in Gloucestershire with her horses and chickens, steady and grounding and always there. She had seen the whole arc of it, and she had done all of this while simultaneously being responsible for one of the largest and most complicated inheritance challenges in the English aristocracy. She married Andrew Cavendish in April 1941, when she was 20 and he was 21, and they had been introduced in the normal way of young people in their world. She described the early years of the marriage as primarily functional rather than passionate. They were young, they were in a war, Andrew was going to serve and might not come back. The decision to marry was not without feeling, but it was also not unmixed with the sense that very large events were happening around them, and that the ordinary private romantic timeline was not the timeline that applied. Andrew became the 11th Duke of Devonshire in 1950, when his father died, and with the dukedom came Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, one of the great houses of England, containing art collections of international significance, managed estates, farm operations, and a death duties bill of extraordinary proportions. The duty owed to the inland revenue on the inheritance was so large, in the currency of the post-war moment, that the simplest financial analysis suggested the house might need to be sold or otherwise disposed of. Andrew's family had spent decades accumulating what the inheritance tax now threatened to dissolve in a single generation. Deborah did not sell it. She spent the next 4 decades working with Andrew, and then, after his death in 2004, continuing alone, to turn Chatsworth into a financially self-sustaining institution. She opened it to visitors. She developed the farm shop. She attended to the gardens, the cafe, the gift shop, the publishing operation that produced books about the house and its collections. She ran it with a combination of professional acumen and genuine personal feeling for the place that is not reducible to either category alone. She wrote about it, about farming, about the gardens, about the experience of living inside one of the great English houses as something other than a ruin or a museum. Her books sold well. Her observations about country life had the Mitford sharpness without the Mitford extremity, which is to say they were funny and precise and never less than honest about the work involved. The scale of what Deborah accomplished at Chatsworth is genuinely difficult to convey, but the essential point is this. She took a house that was, by the early 1950s, a candidate for demolition or transfer to the National Trust, and turned it into an institution that paid its own way. This required financial expertise, management ability, aesthetic judgment, physical stamina, and the specific quality of holding a very large complex operation in your head as a single coherent thing while attending to all of its components simultaneously. He was close to Nancy until Nancy's death in 1973. She was the sister whose letters Nancy found most reliably entertaining in the final years, the one who could make her laugh even when the pain was too heavy for almost everything else. She maintained a complicated warmth with Diana across the full span of their lives, finding in Diana the sister rather than the politics, which was the kind of distinction that only someone with very secure foundations could make without either condemning herself as morally blind or exhausting herself with constant judgment. She corresponded with Jessica across the decades with the particular quality of 2 people who have very little in common politically and are bound by something older and deeper than politics. She became a public figure in the way that very few Mitford sisters managed without catastrophe, not through scandal or extremism, but through the sustained dignity of actual achievement. Chatsworth under Deborah's stewardship became what it is today, a house that survives, that is visited by hundreds of thousands of people annually, that holds its collection intact, that employs people from the surrounding area, that continues. This is not a minor achievement. Against the arithmetic of post-war death duties and the structural challenges of maintaining a property at this scale without the labor force that the pre-war aristocracy had relied on, it is remarkable. She gave her last major interview in the years before her death and was, by every account, in full possession of her faculties and her opinions and the specific Mitford quality of being completely unafraid to say what she thought. Whether the subject was her sister's politics or her brother's death, or the current state of the English countryside, or the problem with modern agriculture. She had watched the entire 20th century, from the English garden in Munich to the end of the Cold War and beyond, and she had thoughts about most of it. She died on September 24, 2014. She was 94. She was the last Mitford sister. The nursery, finally, was empty. Chapter 10, The Letters, the Thing That Held. What strikes me most, having followed this family from the barn at Asthall to the churchyard at Swinbrook, from the Osteria Bavaria in Munich to the funeral parlors of California, from Holloway Prison to Chatsworth House, from the English Garden on September 3, 1939, to a Devon churchyard in September 2014, is not the politics or the scandal or the historical appointments. It is the letters. The Mitford sisters wrote to each other. They wrote constantly, voluminously, in a voice so specific that when the letters were eventually collected and published, they constituted a literary document as significant as any of the novels. A record not just of what they did, but of how they thought, how they spoke to each other, what they found funny, what they found unbearable, how they dealt with death and disagreement, and the accumulating wreckage and abundance of 7 decades of extreme living. The voice in the letters is the nursery voice, that combination of high intelligence and comic deflection and total absence of sentiment in the conventional sense, because sentiment for the Mitfords was always expressed sideways, through the joke, through the nickname, through the deliberate bathos that everyone in the family knew was love. The remarkable thing about the letters is not the history in them, though there is history on every page. It is the consistency of the voice. A letter Nancy wrote to Jessica in 1942 and a letter she wrote to Deborah in 1972 carry the same voice. Slightly sharper, more distilled by age, but the same person, the same comedy, the same refusal to be tragic about things that are undeniably tragic. Whatever the Mitford nursery produced, it produced people who knew how to be themselves, consistently and completely, from beginning to end. Hay wrote to each other when they were on opposite sides of a war. Nancy wrote to Diana in Holloway. Jessica wrote to Deborah from California. Deborah wrote to Nancy in Paris during the final illness. They wrote when they were angry and when they were grieving and when they were simply bored and needed an audience capable of following the specific frequencies of the Mitford mind. The letters continued after Unity's death and after Tom's death and after Nancy's death and after Pamela's death, shrinking in their circuit with each one gone, until only Deborah was left, writing to no one. The political positions, the fascism, the communism, the novels that exposed the class system from inside it, the farmhouse in Gloucestershire, the great house in Derbyshire, were the outward expressions of what the nursery produced. But the letters were the nursery itself, still running, still insisting on its voice, still converting the most extreme material in the world into something that sounded, on the page, like 6 people who had known each other from the beginning, talking. They are still talking, in the letters. The nursery held. Chapter 11. What the nursery produced. We began with a park bench in Munich. We end in a Derbyshire house that is still standing. The distance between those 2 points, the 25-year-old with a pistol in the English garden and the 94-year-old who had kept a ducal house alive through the entire arc of the 20th century, is the distance the Mitford story travels. It is not a distance measured in miles. It is measured in the consequences of 6 people who were given unlimited intelligence and no direction, who went in every direction simultaneously, who touched every major political and cultural force of their era, and who, through everything, never stopped writing to each other. There is no tidy moral to the Mitford story. It is not a story about the dangers of fascism or the redemptive power of literature, though it contains both. It is a story about the utterly unpredictable outcome of a particular set of conditions. 1 household, 2 imperfect parents, 1 barn full of books, and 6 women who were not given a map and consequently made one, in 6 different directions, for better and for worse, and mostly both simultaneously. Diana never recanted. Unity never recovered. Tom never came home. Jessica never came back. Nancy never stopped finding it all material. Pamela kept her chickens. Deborah kept the house. What do you do with a family like this? You read them. You argue about them. You find yourself inexplicably liking all of them, including the ones you should not, because they are so completely, impossibly, specifically themselves that the normal categories of admiration and condemnation turn out to be insufficient. You find yourself at 3 a.m. reading one more letter, following one more thread, because the voice in the letters is unlike any other voice, and it keeps insisting on your attention. They were the most dangerous aristocrats in England. Dangerous to the assumptions of their class, dangerous to the politics of their era, dangerous to each other, dangerous to any simple understanding of how history works or how families work or how ideology and love and intelligence combine inside the same house over the same years to produce outcomes that no one could have predicted from the inside. The Mitford story does not have a moral. It has a fact that out of one household with the same parents and the same nursery and the same library and the same education that was mostly no education at all, came the entire range of what a human being can do with the 20th century, from the worst of it to the best of it and back. This is not an argument for or against anything. It is simply the most interesting family the century produced, which is not the same thing as the best or the most admirable. It is just the most interesting. And interesting, in the end, is what lasts. 9 sisters, 1 brother, 1 barn full of books, 1 century that happened to them at full force. They held each other in letters through all of it. The nursery held.